Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, Lockerbie, Libya, and the media.
Shock and outrage around the world.
The story, as reported from different vantage points.
So I shamelessly say, no, I want him to fail.
Has this American talk radio host taken over the Republican Party? Would-be suicide bombers and the comedy show that's searching for an audience online. And look out, Wall Street.
The film director, he's filming me right now.
Here comes Michael Moore. It's one of those places that turned into a dateline and remains journalistic shorthand for a major news story, Lockerbie. The 1988 bombing of an American passenger jet over that Scottish town is back in the headlines with the decision by Scotland's Justice Minister to release convicted bomber Abdelbasset Al-meghrahi on compassionate grounds. Media tend to report stories from their own country's perspective, and three countries have direct stakes in this one. The U.S., where most of the 259 passengers were from, the U.K., where the plane crashed, and Libya, which gave Al-meghrahi a hero's welcome on his return home. Our starting point this week is Lockerbie. How in those three countries the story is being reported, and whether the media or anyone will ever get to the bottom of what really happened.
Convicted mass murderer Abdelbasset Al-meghrahi will be released from this Scottish prison and be allowed to fly home to Libya to die.
This was very much a global story in the making.
History was made today. The first ever Scottish National Party Justice Secretary released from prison a man convicted of one of the worst terrorist crimes in memory.
It started off as a relatively small story about a suggested release, but since then it's snowballed tremendously.
20 years after the UK's worst aviation disaster, one of its perpetrators has been freed to widespread condemnation.
It's the largest terrorist attack on Americans before 9/11, and it is the biggest terrorist attack in British history, and also the biggest miscarriage of justice in Scottish history. And these are all reasons why it's become a really big media story.
The only convicted bomber.
To hear the Western media report this story, there were two main issues. First, the decision to release a dying man, a convicted murderer of 270 people, and to do so out of compassion. Second, there were the TV pictures that beamed out of Tripoli of Abdelbasset Al-meghrahi basking in front of an adoring, flag-waving crowd of Libyans.
Well, the British coverage has been slightly nuanced. The tabloids have basically said that releasing meghrahi was madness and that the guy's a terrorist. The British broadsheets have had a slightly more nuanced view.
Abdelbasset Al-meghrahi was released on compassionate grounds because he was gravely ill. In
the British media, the issue of compassion has been treated as something that is morally acceptable, whilst an occasional question has been cast as to whether it's an appropriate way of dealing with somebody that's been sort of convicted of a very major crime.
But I'm also made it quite clear that you have shown to the victims who might expect he served more than 11.5 days per death.
This is former U.S. Ambassador of the United States.
But then what happened was the American reaction.
If this does not make you furious, nothing will. This Libyan terrorist is a cold-blooded murderer, a mass murderer, and now he is home in Libya with his family.
The American approach has been more like the tabloid UK approach, disbelief.
But it is absolutely unbelievable.
Shock.
Shock and outrage around the world.
Horror.
This is a disgrace.
That meghrahi could have been released on compassionate grounds.
That is one of the most familiar refrains in the media. Why, in return, should he be shown compassion? The media can't really get past that.
Meghrahi's release did not come as a surprise to the Arab media. In Libya in particular, this is seen as an end to the hostility chapter between Libya and the West, and the beginning of a new chapter that is based on cooperation and economic interests. Here, the coverage was sentimental. Everybody viewed meghrahi as a national hero who helped his country get out of its isolation at the beginning of the new millennium.
The Arab media, they have been more skeptical of the facts, and they've been more prone to ask the big questions like, is Libya really involved? Why was there a miscarriage of justice? Who fixed the trial?
That's a question that's been asked often, and not just in the Arab world. Robert Black, the Scottish law professor who helped set up the special court to hear the Lockerbie case, called the verdict a wrongful conviction and said that the victim was an innocent man. The UN sent an observer to the trial, Austrian Hans Kochler, who was highly critical. And when Al-meghrahi's first appeal was dismissed in 2002, he described it as a spectacular miscarriage of justice. Al-meghrahi was finally granted an appeal in 2007. However, the prosecution was allowed to delay the appeal for more than 2 years. Robert Black called that an absolute disgrace. Even families in Lockerbie, who lost loved ones when the plane crashed, have said the Scottish court convicted the wrong man. The local priest said the same thing. So, given all of the questions around the case, where was that context in the coverage of Al-meghrahi's release?
He went to prison for his role in the bombing, sentenced to life, but only served 8 years. 8 years.
I don't think that a lot of the Western media has analysed the background to the story or the case against Meghrahi, quite simply because when you have a story about an Arab, Muslim, a bomb and an aeroplane, automatically people know which side of the fence that they're on. They see it as a story about terrorism and they don't scratch beneath the surface.
The bottom line is there was a full judicial process which found him guilty, and essentially that's the starting point for a lot of the media. It would take a very brave institution to come out and speak out against that.
I think the American media sees this as a black and white case where everything is clear and self-evident. So it feels quite comfortable in assuming the moral high ground and insisting that this prisoner should not be released.
But if Abdelbaset Al-meghrahi really is an innocent man, that puts a rather different light on the media spectacle that the world watched from Libya, the images that politicians and media in the West found so hard to stomach.
I was repulsed by the reception that a convicted bomber guilty of a huge terrorist crime received on his return to Libya.
In terms of the hero's welcome, I felt there was a point being made. Whereas here in the Western media, we all thought it was about the West. There's also a domestic issue going on.
Should the Libyans have toned it down? No. Why? Was it reasonable for Obama and Gordon Brown to call for the Libyans to tone it down? No, it was very foolish because what the Libyans choose to do, how they view Meghrahi, is up to them. This was purely a national issue, and the Libyans viewed him as a hero.
Different countries, different perspectives, and in the way the news was reported, completely different stories. Lockerbie and the case of Abdelbaset Al-meghrahi is a textbook example of how one man's terrorist can be another man's hero. Sometimes it just depends on what channel you watch. Here's how our Global Village Voices see this latest chapter in the reporting of the Lockerbie story.
The story certainly received play in the Arab media, but opinion pages weren't exactly overflowing with commentary. Arab journalists weren't sure how to play the story because, like many Arabs, they aren't quite sure what they should think about it. Lockerbie was a long time ago, and the details are hazy.
Not dealt with at all is the hypocrisy of the criticism in the Western media. They say Al-meghrahi is a terrorist and should be in prison. There should be no compassion for terrorists and those convicted of crimes. But of course, there is never mention of any historical facts like individuals in the West convicted and charged and accused of crimes involving the murder of Arabs in the Middle East.
Many U.S. media outlets in particular interviewed the families of the victims, expressing their outrage some 20 years after the plane exploded in the air. This is a tendency of the U.S. media to describe terrorism solely on emotional terms, without fostering any kind of productive discussion on its root causes or how to resolve conflict.
If you'd like to be one of our Global Village Voices, here's how you do it. You can email us at listeningpost@aljazeera.net or try Facebook and look for the Listening Post page there. You can also follow us through Twitter. We will let you know via Facebook and Twitter what stories we're working on and how you can get with the program and contribute to our broadcast. Time now for Listening Post News Bites. The news industry was already in trouble before the economic downturn began, and here's an indication that the problems have now reached the very top. Rupert Murdoch, the CEO of the world's largest media group, News Corp, has taken a 28% pay cut from $27.5 million down to just under $20 million. News Corp reported a loss of $3.4 billion in its last annual report and blamed its problems on advertising revenues, which are tanking pretty much across the board. That has Murdoch now talking about charging readers for accessing news online. News Corp's catalog of media outlets includes the Fox News Network and more than 170 newspapers worldwide, the largest and most influential of which are The Sun and The Times in the UK and The Wall Street Journal and The New York Post in the US. There's a diplomatic dust-up between the Israeli and Swedish governments over a newspaper article that accused the Israeli army of stealing body parts from dead Palestinian men back in the early 1990s. The article appeared in Sweden's Aftonbladet newspaper. Freelance journalist Donald Bostrom wrote it. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called the report outrageous and demanded that the Swedish government condemn the article and apologize for its publication. The Swedish Foreign Minister Carl Bildt said, quote, "If I devoted myself to correcting all the strange claims in the media, I would probably not have time to devote to very much else," unquote. The Israelis have since said that they will freeze the issuing of entry visas to Swedish reporters and deny those reporters already in Israel access to Gaza. When that power-sharing deal was reached last year in Zimbabwe between President Robert Mugabe's ZANU-PF party and Prime Minister Morgan Tsvangirai's MDF, part of that deal was the reshaping of the Zimbabwe Media Commission. The commission's job is to make sure news is reported freely and fairly, which has not been the case under most of Mugabe's rule. Now, just about a year later, the two sides have still not agreed on who should be on that commission. There are indications that Zimbabwe is opening up to the media. It recently allowed the BBC back into the country. However, the political fight over the makeup of the media commission is a pretty sure sign that trouble lies ahead. YouTube is a media space that hosts videos and short films that are not quite and may never be ready for primetime TV. Living with the Infidels is an example of that. It's a 5-part series that calls itself Comedy and tells the story of 5 British would-be suicide bombers who, while preparing for martyrdom, discover that the West isn't so bad. The series' director, Asaf Ainapur, said he got the idea when he noticed that in the British media, the word bumbling often accompanied the word terrorist. The mother of a victim of the 7/7 bombings in London has slammed the director, saying he would see things differently if he had lost a loved one in the attack. Ainapur shot back that his series actually ridicules extremism and therefore aims to dissuade young Muslims from becoming radicals. We're back after the break with a piece on the king of American talk radio and how he strikes fear into the hearts of politicians there.